Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, name is Abitchonistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security to defend Israel. Thank you so much for all of our viewers and supporters for tuning in. This is a particularly important briefing we are doing because by popular request, we're talking about assassinations and assassination attempts. A lot of people have asked for this topic, so I'm very pleased to be able to present it with the head of IDSF Research, or Yissachar. Or thank you so much for joining.
It's great to be here, Moshe.
So let's jump right in. We know that during this war in Gaza and all of the action up in Lebanon, Israel seems to have a strategy of targeted assassination attempts for the upper echelons of the leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah. Are you able to share with us a little bit of background about what the IDF has done so far in this war and the value of this strategy?
Right. So first of all, it's great to be here, Moshe, and absolutely assassinating top leaders in Hamas, in Hezbollah, and other organizations has been a top priority for Israel in this war, knowing that the structure, and I talked to senior officials who are, on the ground and are very much engaged in this war, including in the artillery and management of the different brigades and commands of the war. And what they say is very clear. It's true that in order to defeat Hamas or Hezbollah, for that matter, would take a lot more than just taking down officials. It will take conquering land. It will take taking down abilities and warehouses and ammunition, all that. But usually the one in the top of the pyramid is the one that structure is leaning on. So let's say you kill, like we just did, the chief of the Khan Yunis brigade in Gaza. This guy actually centralized the whole Khan Yunis area command and control of Hamas. Now, it's true that he has a deputy, and we attempted to assassinate him as well. It's true there is a whole chain of command, but as soon as you take down the head of the pyramid, you are far more likely to defeat the smaller structures. Okay, so if you take the entire power structure, basically. The IDF said that out of 24 battalions, we've taken down 21 battalions of Hamas. Now, that does not mean that 700 to 800 members of these battalions, the combatants, the terrorists of Hamas, were taken down. It means that the head of the battalion, its deputies, and let's say the rank 2 and 3 of this battalion were taken down. Many of the terrorists were taken down or arrested, and the battalion ceased to operate as a battalion. So that's one thing. So you take down the structure. The second thing I'll say is that I think what we just witnessed in the Gaza Strip, the attempt to assassinate Muhammad Deif, as he was called, he was basically the head of the Hamas's military wing. They call it the Din al-Qassam brigades. Now, the estimate is that he was indeed taken down. And think about it, a guy, arch terrorist who was there was an attempt on his life for like 7 or 8 attempts on his life, and even since the 1990s. So this guy was actually in charge of operating the entire military effort of Hamas. And senior military officials told me he is the #1 guy in Hamas, unofficially, even though officially it's Yahya Sinwar, but it's all up to him. What I want to say is that if you take down such a high-level target, it is not just yet another terrorist. Some people are irreplaceable. If you remember Qasem Soleimani, that under President Trump's administration was taken down in Iraq, he was the head of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. This guy was the architect, really the visionary of the entire Iranian takeover of the Middle East. He founded many different branches in Lebanon, in Iraq, different areas. He orchestrated the attack on the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. Taking this guy down and replacing him with Ismail Qaani, which, as much as you regard him, as much high regard people may attribute to him, he is not Qasem Soleimani. He'll never will be. So I think in that respect, yes, taking down senior targets has an enormous value. But it is not everything. You need to neutralize a structure, an organization to take over territory, to take down their capabilities in terms of firepower. And then you start talking about defeating Hamas, defeating Hezbollah.
Now let's just focus for a second on Muhammad Deif. Is he dead? Is he not dead? Well, there's competing reports. Usually does Hamas admit when a senior official is killed? How does all of that work?
Well, we don't know yet, but the estimate is, well, 12 tons of explosives were dropped on the building where he very likely was. And we sure hope he was dead because, again, he was a key figure. He was really Israel's nemesis, if you will. Muhammad Deif is not yet another terrorist. It was confirmed that the Khan Yunis brigade commander who was with him, according to most estimates, was killed. It was confirmed. So I really hope that attests to him too. Look, Muhammad Deif survived 7 or 8 assassination attempts. In Hebrew, we say every cat has 9 souls. Maybe in the 9th time, he doesn't have a reserve soul anymore. So let's hope that's the case because Israel already attempted on his life multiple times, including in a car where they thought he was left with no limbs for 20 years. And then the IDF found out newly taken photos of him in the Gaza Strip, looking well and sound and well. So that's one thing. Second, there was an attempt in September of 2003 to take down the entire Hamas leadership in a structure where they stayed in the Al Rimal neighborhood. It's like sort of, you can call it Gaza's Martha's Vineyard, if you may. That's the neighborhood where all the senior officials of Hamas have big fancy houses. And they all stayed in one structure, Ismail Haniyeh, Muhammad Deif, all of these big names in one structure. But Israel feared too large collateral damage on civilians. So they used small bomb instead of a big bomb, not 5 tons of explosives, but I believe it was half a ton. And that, of course, didn't kill the Hamas leadership, just made them flee. And there was really Avi Dichter, who was head of the ISA back in the day, he was currently a minister. We met him. He said, biggest mistake we ever did. We could have taken down the entire Hamas leadership if we just took out the entire building. And as I said, names matter and leaders matter, but it's not the only element. Usually Hamas would publish that. In his case, it's a very unusually senior name. Even Marwan Issa, who was taken down, is Hamas number 3 in Gaza, was taken down in a tunnel. Hamas confirmed that. And they reacted with a barrage of rockets. Usually, when Israel takes down senior Hamas officials, PIJ officials in Gaza, that ignites a war. That's what happened last year. If you remember, there was an operation against the PIJ. Hamas didn't intervene. It was a year ago. Once you took down 2 of their commanders at once, a barrage of rockets, missiles on Tel Aviv, on Jerusalem, and on the entire south. Hamas didn't react this time. So either one, they've left with almost no capabilities left, and 2, they might not want to admit that Muhammad Deif is dead. They might want to preserve his name and sort of reputation as a mystery, as a legend. We'll see.
Now, whenever Israel engages in these types of attacks, as you noted, there are civilian casualties. Are you able to just describe who these civilians are who are circled in those areas, and how Israel decides the cost of collateral damage, so to speak?
I'll tell you something. I consume international media quite often, U.S. media and international media. What I fail to understand is how come these media outlets who are supposed to be the champions of fact-checking, who profess to be, adhering to the truth and warning us all from fake news and the age of post-truth. How come they quote and echo Hamas propaganda so often? Even if it's sort of coated in a nice, pleasant cover-up of the so-called Gaza Ministry of Health or Gaza Health Authorities or local health authorities in Gaza, then it is quoted in a UN report, then media outlets quote it. So it's really, if you go back to the sources, you go back to the root, is simply Hamas propaganda. Hamas claimed that in this attack, over 200 civilians were killed. They are, by the way, PR masters. They are already branding it as the Khan Yunis massacre and all these things. And I see Wikipedia articles and entries who already, not in this specific case, but other cases, frame Israeli attacks as the school massacre, the UNRWA school massacre. It is simply not the case. I'll just give you another example. Last month, there was an Israeli strike on an UNRWA school in Gaza. True, there was an attack on a school in Gaza, but telling you and It was published that some 35 people were killed. If you only tell that to the viewers, you are not just misleading them, not just telling half the truth, you are lying to them by definition. Because saying that 35 people were killed in a school, in an airstrike on a school, does not tell you 10% of what you need to know. There were no civilians in that school. Hamas militants used it as a military compound, and by definition, at that moment, it instantly becomes a military target. So the IDF indeed is simply concrete from that point on, according to any international, law of armed conflict. And that's exactly what happened in this case. So 17 Hamas militants were killed. No civilians were killed, but still it was framed as, as the school massacre. So all these things, we just need to be very, very careful about any information coming out of the Gaza Strip. Hamas knows, in Hebrew we say, what strings to pluck on, right? What sentiments will take are taken on, and what kind of sentiment should play on. And I think we need to be extra careful on the deliberate misleading attempts by Hamas to present all of these attacks were justified to end the war and to take Hamas down, to present them as attacks on civilians.
I want to again thank all of our viewers who send in questions during our live Zoom, either in the chat or in the email here. Or let me ask you a question. You come out of the intelligence community of the IDF, and obviously prior to October 7th, there's been much criticism about the intelligence that the IDF had in Gaza, whereas now, as the story goes, Deif was coming out of a tunnel up for a breather, and the IDF was able to target him very specifically, indicating a very high level of intelligence. So have things changed in terms of the operations of the intelligence community in Gaza?
Yes, 100%. And we have now a much, much more thorough and in-depth idea of what's going on in Gaza, thanks to the ground maneuver. Yoan Busquela, who you know very well, he says that with air power, you can only destroy. You can't build anything. And when forces are on the ground, they collect intelligence. What was found in the El Shifa hospital raid, the two of them, by the way, was invaluable. It was a treasure of intelligence. It was, if you remember the Bin Laden raid, it was, you could have, the U.S. Air Force could have taken that structure up from the air, but they preferred not to. They preferred to engage and to collect intelligence, and that proved to be invaluable, honestly. So all these materials, whether be it computers and hard drives, and I talked to combatants who found really command and control centers who look like they're taken from the Matrix movie. Entire war rooms with computer screens and cameras all over the place. So they really are very much aware to technology, and being on the ground to monitor it really helps. We have much better humans in Gaza right now, thanks to the fact that we are inside and not like separated by a fence and we're here and they're there, and this binary form of interaction. There's only so much you can do with SIGINT, signal intelligence, you know, tracking phones and emails, and SMS messages. You can do much more with a human when you're on the ground. That's how also Arab culture really works. The cafe and shisha culture of, meeting in the neighborhood cafe and schmoozing and talking, and then the people who have street cred, and then you meet them, and then you start mingling with them, and you go to meetings, and you start knowing the structure of an organization. That's really how it works. These people, Muhammad Deif, Yahya Sinwar, they don't really text each other very rarely. They mostly use people who are their emissaries and their messengers. So it's a bit like with the Bin Laden case, where they really humans proved to be proved invaluable. And I think I would like to vindicate a little bit the intelligence community, because I come from there. We had great intelligence on Gaza. I gotta say now it's incomparably better. But I tell you something that it makes sense. Anytime you engage and you're on the ground, you collect much better intelligence. We chose to be disengaging from Gaza and have not having the greatest intelligence in the world on Gaza itself. We have much better intelligence on Lebanon and Iran, even. But I'll tell you something. It's not like the intelligence had a blind spot for Gaza. It's not like the intelligence didn't know that Hamas was preparing a massacre. They did, and I know personally people, analysts who knew the material, who gave the alert, who knew the plans very well, even detailed them, in great detail, to be honest, shocking detail, if you read the articles and publications who were out recently. But I think our problem was the paradigm and the perception, not, collecting the intelligence, but how you perceive the intelligence. And I think it's a great difference. And I think the people on the top didn't want to believe that Hamas is going to make good on its vow to destroy Israel, didn't want to believe that Hamas has an interest to launch a war. So they believed Hamas was building up capabilities to show off, but not really to use them. That was their big mistake. I never bought into that, but that was their big mistake.
Or we've been doing these Zoom briefings since October 8th, and I hope our viewers who have been watching at least for a few months understand that this idea of that paradigm shift, and so many of our speakers and authorities within IDSF have really spoken about, it wasn't about the physical evidence collected as much as the analysis and the perceptions. And at IDSF, we work very hard, you work very hard to change those perceptions, certainly here in Israel. Let me ask another question on this topic before we move on. Sinwar, now that there was this attempt for Deif, is the likelihood of getting Sinwar dropped dramatically? Is he going to be hiding out even more so? Or from the beginning, he knew he was the top target and this hasn't changed much?
I mean, I can only give an educated guess and speculate, but I think that, there's only so much, so many places he can hide in. Sinwar, in my estimate, not according to intelligence that I know, but according to my estimate, he is probably hiding in a tunnel somewhere. And if you believe reports and all sorts of pundits on TV who have military background, he might be surrounding himself with hostages, living Israeli hostages, in order to use them as a human shield. I believe it makes perfect sense because very cynically and very cruelly, that was the reason why they took them in the first place, to use Israeli hostages as human shield. If you remember Yocheved Lifshitz, one of the hostages who came back from Gaza, really an elderly woman, she and another woman were released, a few short weeks after the war erupted, really is a sort of a gesture by Hamas, you can call it, and maybe as an attempt to show willingness. But then she attested that she met Sinwar himself in a tunnel. He came to supervise them, and she had even a short conversation with him. Um, he speaks very well, very good Hebrew, to be honest. Um, I don't know about Sinwar himself, but I think there's only so many places he can hide in, and eventually we're gonna get him.
Okay, let's switch topics entirely. I feel like we could talk about so many things for hours and hours and hours, but another important topic that I know you have expertise on. Israeli military officials, analysts studied at great length the U.S. in Afghanistan and the U.S. departure from Afghanistan. How does that whole episode inform what the IDF might do the day after, so to speak, in Gaza?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. Let me just say this. There was an attempt, especially by President Biden, the Biden administration, Secretary Blinken, to draw a comparison between Afghanistan and Gaza and don't, to say to Israel, which I heard again and again from European parliamentaries and diplomats and others, don't make the same mistake America made. Don't stay in Gaza like we stayed in Afghanistan. Don't get mired into lengthy wars and regime change wars. Simply take out the bad guys. We took out bin Laden, you can take out Sinwar. It's very easy. You don't need to occupy Gaza. You don't need to stay in Gaza. Just leave, accept the deal, and we'll help you. We'll help you take out Sinwar and the bad guys. It doesn't quite work like that. There is, of course, room to learn from Afghanistan, but if you want to draw that comparison, we should, because if you remember Netanyahu in his autobiography, which I read, fascinating book, Netanyahu tested that Secretary Kerry, then John Kerry, now as the climate czar, if I'm not mistaken, but back then he was the Secretary of State, and he offered him, back in 2013, offered Netanyahu to take him to Afghanistan to actually see the model, the big success that was there in nation building, training local forces, democratizing Afghanistan. That really doesn't work. And I think that the reason why it wouldn't work in Gaza like it didn't work in Afghanistan is because there is no tradition of democracy. There is no tradition of pro-Westernism. And in stable regimes like Saudi Arabia, you can sort of play with their interests. In Gaza and in Afghanistan, there's so many little tribes and groups and armed groups. Even in the heydays of the U.S. Occupation of Afghanistan and the sort of the cooperation with local trained Afghan forces and the local Afghan government, there were elections that were held. Still, I researched Afghanistan for several years. The Central African government didn't even control most of the territory they was supposedly holding. Secondly, I think that um, if you want to draw the comparison, sure. I mean, there are many good lessons and bad lessons to learn from Afghanistan. I think the best lesson for sure cost over $2 trillion, 20 years, $300 million per day, over 243,000 fatalities. People who were, casualties, people who were killed, including thousands of U.S. Servicemen and servicewomen. Of course, that wasn't, a model to learn from. But I think it was a good lesson too, because at the end of the day, the U.S. wanted to take out the Taliban. It wanted to take out Al Qaeda. It chose the wrong way to do it, but without occupying Afghanistan, it would have had maybe 100 more 9/11s, because they used the territory as a terrorist hub, just like Hamas used Gaza as a terrorist hub. So if you want to draw that comparison, sure. But then if you take a look over also on the map, Moshe, if you could let me share my screen. Needless to say, there's many lessons to be learned from Afghanistan, but to say that Israel should not be holding Gaza, it's unrealistic. I think one main lesson, one main takeaway from this war is that this engagement doesn't work. Israeli forces need to be on the ground with freedom of operation in Gaza forever. There need to be Israeli forces on the ground in Gaza to make sure that terror doesn't sprout again, and doesn't reemerge. If you look at the map, I don't need to tell. I just want to illustrate it because they always taught me how to visualize the message. So here's Afghanistan, thousands and thousands of miles from the U.S. mainland. All right, thousands of miles. No need to tell you that. You all know that very well. That's Afghanistan. All right. Now, here's the Gaza Strip, right? Right in Israel's backyard. Here's Israel, here's Gaza. So there is really no room for comparison. The U.S. could have afforded this quagmire, this debacle in Afghanistan, leaving in a rush, Taliban taking over within less than 24 hours, back to square one, $2 trillion and 200,000 casualties, all spent for nothing. We came back to square one where the Taliban holds power. But even in those terms, the U.S. is, half a globe away from Afghanistan, and a variety of elements convinced the American administration to withdraw. Israel cannot risk another October 7th coming out from Gaza. We need to stay there, much like there is a freedom of operation all around Judea and Samaria, in Hebron, in Nablus, in Jenin, in Tulkarm, in Jericho, all around Judea and Samaria, in order to keep what we call lawn mowing, right? Keep mowing the lawn and keep arresting terrorists and taking down terrorists. There are no rockets in Judea and Samaria right now. There are many rockets in Gaza. Why? Because the IDF is there. I talked to combatants who found rockets and mortars and missiles and even attempts to dig tunnels into Israeli cities in Judea and Samaria. The same effort cannot have been carried out in Gaza. And I'll just say this. Of course, coming back to an earlier point about assassination attempts and regicides and taking down leaders. Of course, that taking down Sinwar and Deif is a major turning point, and it's an achievement. But to say for a U.S. president or a U.S. administration to say that's our goal, that's our objective, it's simply not, it has nothing to do, in my opinion, with reality, because you don't simply have two leaders as your problem. You have an entire population as your problem. You have an entire terrorist organization as your problem. For 20 years, they trained and brainwashed generations of Palestinians. So even if you take down Sinwar, what's going to happen? You still have tens of thousands of terrorists in Gaza. So that's just, throwing sand in the eyes of Israelis. And I think it's unrealistic to make Israel compromise over its security once again.
Sure, and it's a really sharp point comparing Gaza to Judea and Samaria in terms of the occupational presence that the IDF has. So let me ask you, not looking at the international voices, but within Israel, the national security community who potentially are at odds with your approach, with the approach of IDSF, and want a complete withdrawal again from Gaza to do a repeat of 2006. What do they say about Judea and Samaria? I mean, do they make a splice and say, no, it's okay to be in Judea and Samaria, but not in Gaza? Or are the same voices advocating for complete withdrawal from Gaza also suggesting to do the very same in Judea and Samaria?
Well, if you listen to the present-day U.S. administration, if you listen to the European Union, the United Nations, they all say Judea and Samaria and Gaza, Israel should withdraw from all of them. Israel should withdraw from all 67 lines and establish a Palestinian state there. And that's just insanity. I mean, let alone the fact, if you just, not to mention the fact that these are Jewish homelands. This is a native indigenous Jewish homelands that we came back to after illegal Jordanian occupation and after having been exiled for 2,000 years. Um, these have never been Palestinian territories, but if you just leave that aside and look at this on a security perspective, it is madness to think that Israel has any capability to safeguard itself from the 67 lines. It's unrealistic. No military expert will tell you it's possible. The IDF will not be able to defend Israel from the 67 lines. People have to understand that. If we talk about confiscating missiles and rockets, stopping tunnels, even strategically dominating the entire Holy Land, the entire land of Israel from the mountaintop is, day one of military academy. I mean, if you don't actually expect the IDF to protect Tel Aviv or the Sharon area or other places in Israel for that matter, from a sea level lowland, while Hamas land is on the top of the mountain range, if you have ever been to these areas, you stand on top of the mountain, you see the entire Israel, really, on your palm. So I think really the idea that Israel can somehow defend itself is absurd. And I think only permanent IDF presence, Israeli security presence around Judea and Samaria and around Gaza can make sure that Israel never again allows terrorism to sprout again. I think that's basics we learned. The president, which I respect, whom I respect a lot, he says, don't make the same mistake America made, but then he is expecting us to do this, make the same mistake that America made. The Oslo Accords, the disengagement plan from Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, those are all mistakes that America made. And then that Israel made too, quite frankly. So we don't need to repeat the mistakes of the past. I quite agree. We don't need to go back to disengagement. We don't need to go back to Palestinian Authority. We don't need to go back to the Oslo Accords. We need to finally understand basic principles, basic security tenets that will always survive. Permanent Israeli presence on the ground to prevent terrorism from sprouting and metastasizing.
Well said. Or Yissachar, head of the IDSF Research Department. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for sharing your expertise with all of our viewers. And of course, thank you to the viewers for tuning in and watching this briefing. We will be back with you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.